Hey everyone, welcome back to Data and Donuts. My name's Aaron. I'm here with my friend and colleague Loris from IVC. Today we're going to talk a little bit about enterprise systems and then also open source systems in the area of applications, their implementation, use, training, and the like. But before we get into our conversation today, I'll have Loris tell us a little bit about himself.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Loris Fagioli. I'm currently the Director of Research Planning and Accreditation at Irvine Valley College.
Oops. I can edit that stuff out. That's what the magic is. So thanks again so much, Loris, for joining me today. And today like I said, we're going to really look into, I know your school uses a variety of approaches, not just with applications, but training, onboarding, and setting standards and creating new and innovative, I call them projects, topics, and also systems that we can use across to California. And so knowing your vast experience, let's start with what enterprise systems, if you want to name a few that you use, and we're not going to do like a product review, but what do you like about them and just enterprise systems in general?
Yeah, so we have a few. One is because we have a data warehouse, so we're very lucky that we do have a data warehouse district-wide. So one of our tools that all the analysts use is SQL. So SQL Server, we have a Microsoft SQL Server. So we code primarily in SQL. And that one is the standard because you cannot pull it any other way. And so that's essentially a lot of, and maybe we can go into that a little bit, and focusing on the onboarding of new analysts. That is essentially almost their first month is just learning SQL and the data warehouse and how to pull data. Because that is often 80-90% of the job is just getting the data in the format, recoding certain elements to fit the needs of specific projects. So that is essentially the standard and that everybody uses. After that, in terms of more kind of data manipulation, analysis, visualization, we do have also one standard. We currently have Tableau as for our dashboards. That is also district-wide. Both colleges in our district are using Tableau. We will see if, as we move to potentially new enterprise systems, if that will continue or if we will move to Power BI. But I think also there it will be the same thing. It would just be one standard. It would either be Power BI or it will be Tableau. I think where we have a little bit more flexibility is in more the analytical software. There we use primarily R, which is an open source software, and it's maybe about 50-50. It was Stata as well. Stata is more from the econ landscape. It's also a code-based language, but it is much easier to learn than R. R has a little bit more of a learning curve. It's a little bit more frustrating. It's much more open, has many, many more packages, has many, many more applications. So it's much broader than Stata. But Stata is very nice to code. It's a very simple language. It's very quickly you realize what you're doing, and it's very easy to if you run into errors to fix those. So those are our two primary software statistical packages we're using.
And it's interesting when you were just sharing right now about, some are a little bit harder to code and those more the open source, but the open source, what you also mentioned, that it provides you a vast range of just different tools, different plugins, different builds, and different packages. And so when you think about that, I see those are the advantages. What are the limitations that are tied with open source?
The primary limitation with R is it is kind of difficult to learn. It's not easy, right? Because it is such a vast open source software, you have many, especially we call packages. So packages are essentially, you have base R, which is kind of maintained. And then you have different authors, either people who create new statistical, ways of doing things. They create packages that you can download and install on your computer, and every person does it slightly differently. So every time you install a new package, you have to then read through the documentation of how that package, you have to format things and how to save things, and how does it require the input, what is the output. And so every single package has a slightly different way of doing it. And that becomes a little bit frustrating because you might not be used to it. And also, R is more kind of computer science-y. So it is not intuitive the way you do it. It is not step-by-step approach. So what I do like, for instance, in SPSS or in Stata, every line is a new step, right? So you write one line and you go to the next line, that's the next step, right? So it's more kind of, oh, you want to create this variable, then you want to figure this out, and then you modify that. And that is not the way sometimes it works. It's just sometimes kind of this weird thing where actually you start in the middle and then you build out, similar to like SQL. So it's much more difficult to learn, and if you run into errors, they can be very frustrating. If you go on Google and figure out, hey, what does this error mean? Then you have all these computer scientists talk about the solutions, and you're like, whoa, I have no idea what that actually means. So the level of coding and familiarity with computer software is, I think, a little bit higher. Um, One little funny anecdote is I have just recently started using ChatGPT to error code. It is amazing with R. It is quite fascinating. It's not error free, especially if you go into more complicated stuff, it starts running into issues. But if you think about ChatGPT as essentially a glorified, better Google search. So if I go into Google and try to figure out how to do it, it usually takes me 2 hours. With ChatGPT, it maybe takes me 5 to 10 minutes, and you get a similar results. And now, similar to Google and ChatGPT, sometimes it does not apply, and you have to kind of keep figuring out what's going on. But it's a much faster search tool. So now maybe with ChatGPT, maybe the learning curve is a little bit flatter with ChatGPT.
That's cool. I think something to plug into that is if you want to go to languages, I would probably go to Bard. Right now, I'm using that for languages. It's really, really good with about 19 different languages. So I think with that, I've plugged that in for R, also with Python, and it puts out some pretty good output. I do like ChatGPTs because both of them actually have the notes in there, so it explains what you're doing and when you're doing it, what's it supposed to do. So I think that's always nice to have that documentation into there, and then you can even take your code, run it through there, and be like, "Hey, can you debug this?" And it can do that. And there's a new thing with Google called Google Labs. I think everybody has it now, so it's not like something special, but it's their built-in GPT that they can plug in. I know there's a few others that are happening, and it's interesting. And I said we're gonna go a little off the rails on this, is how many platforms are now integrating their AI into that. So, for example, many of them have already had it. I know that Power BI is coming out with it soon to just roll into there to say what you're doing. I know even Excel for prior to this had that, where you just have raw data. It's almost like it's not unsupervised learning, but it's following that same logic of unsupervised learning, that it has analyzed, and you just press that button and it just looks at your raw data and says, hey, did you see these trends in between there? Now, it doesn't know which trend you're trying to reach out to: success, outcome, enrollment, whatever trend you're looking at, but it can show you interesting trends, and it's already put it in a graphical format, so it's consumable, and that you may be able to ingest that. And I think those are really good for maybe not as much technical users. But I was funny that you mentioned that you go into ChatGPT to do that, because that was going to be my next question, is like, what's your perspective on that? Because you're right, sometimes it doesn't have that, but if you have a couple of GPTs to add to or to run across, it's actually pretty relevant and it's pretty cool. So cool.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, anybody knows it does not know if it's right or wrong. And it's funny, the conversation you can have with ChatGPT, and it's like, hey, why did you do it this way? Aren't you supposed to do it this way? And he's like, oh yeah, thank you for letting me know. You can also do it this way. And then, you can, it's more a conversation. So for me, if it's completely, if you have no idea and you go into it and just copy paste, you probably create a lot of issues. But for somebody who already has some familiarity, and let's say in a team, you already have, somebody train you and figure out, and you have maybe some code that you can use, and not start from a blank screen. But then the issue is, especially for people who are new to coding, is you get stuck very quickly. You don't know, why is there this error? Why cannot go past this? And then usually you go to Google, right? You go to Google and try to search how to do things or what does this error mean. And instead of going to Google, you go to ChatGPT. I feel it's just much faster. You still run into issues. You still get solutions that are not true solutions for you, but it's a much faster and more succinct search engine essentially for me. So I think that is could be new thing, but nothing obviously replaces somebody like a team. So I have a very lucky situation where I have extremely strong team members, and that team spirit of being able to ask somebody, hey, I got stuck, can you help me with this? That is tremendously beneficial. But you don't want to become that person that asks a question every 2 minutes. So I think that's where Google and ChatGPT come in. And then you have somebody, we have code review every week. We do code line by line review because as everybody knows, it's the devil is in the details, right? So you can catch some errors when you just look at summary tables or at graphs and you're like, hey, that looks funky. What's going on there? But even if the graph looks fine, the trend looks fine, everything checks out, and you go into the code, you realize, hold on, you've used this field, or you've merged it this way, or you've limited this way. So we do code review every week, and that's also where you see different styles of coding. You learn from others how they do things, and you kind of get this error checking. So I think if that is combined with a strong team culture and a strong code review culture, I would not be afraid of using ChatGPT, as essentially as a helping hand as people progress in their knowledge of coding.
I think you bring up a really good approach. And it's really kind of a transitional talk is to our next topic of really data quality and integrity. And I think when you talk about going through code, I think that's very elemental to all the work we do. And I don't know how many institutions do that. They just trust whatever their warehouse puts out, right? Like the data's the data. And I think in those aspects, how do you verify? I know, and I'll speak for our team, is we've developed our own system. It's like 300 pages of just SQL of how do you pull from different things, bring it together, refining, redefining who's the data, all the way down to the data entry person and department. So you can like if there you find errors, you know where to go and who to contact, and really going through that review process. And as a multi-college district similar to yours, having that large team where you have the data engineers, you have the applications people, you have the senior analysts, you have the programmers all talking. I think that's a key element, and similar to what you're saying with your weekly work. Um, is there suggestions that you would have? Because it sounds like you're doing good. And so with your weekly code review, and so if you could walk me through, is that like scheduled or is it just like, hey, I developed this new code and you look at it? Like what does that look like at your school?
Yeah, I mean, if I take a step back here, so and I'd be interested in seeing what your lessons that you've learned is. So initially, when I started, it was fairly siloed. Each analyst had their own projects, had their own either software that they're familiar with. Some people used Access, some people used Alteryx, some people used Hyperion, some people used SQL, some people use SPSS. So everybody was allowed to work essentially what they wanted to do. Um, when I became director, I realized the downside of that one is if you have staff turnover, even though you might be familiar on the high surface level, and I had the unfortunate thing happen that when I became director, two or three other analysts left at the same time they got promoted. And so my team shrunk very quickly. And when I went into people's folders and files, I had no idea. I had zero idea what happened. People have their naming conventions of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you have, you know, seven different code things in their folder, and you had no idea which one is the most recent. If you open the code and you run the code, it runs immediately into errors because it was just kind of copy paste, and you were supposed to only, run line from 7 to 10 and then skip line 5 to 50. So I very quickly started realizing that is not a a way to work, especially if you have staff turnover. It works if somebody is in the position. And also, when I was hired, my boss at the time, I really credit him with that. He says, listen, if you hire good people, you should expect people to leave if they want to, right? So don't think that if somebody leaves after a year or two, that's a bad sign. It could be, but it also can be a good sign, right? If you hire good people try to find other opportunities. So you need to set up your team with the expectation if everybody leaves at this time, nothing breaks. Obviously, there is always a learning curve. And I am a little bit proud to say that I think if my team, if anybody, if me included, anybody on my team, 50%, 60% leave, nothing will break. So anybody who has a minimum understanding on maybe 1 or 2 days or a week of onboarding of saying, this is our process, this is how we do things. If you go in here, you will immediately, you can pick it up and know what happened. And so that was a little bit of a learning curve because initially I went too prescriptive. You had to, every project had to have a project sheet with like step by step instructions and all these things. And very quickly we realized, number one, you never have time to write that project description, right? So that's way too complicated. You always forget about doing it. So we immediately got rid of that. We only do this now for very, very complicated and high stakes processes. So we only have these project sheets for some of the high level, let's say our program review process, right? Which is very integrated, has many different arms, has many different things. So we have kind of one of those project sheets then. But for most kind of these ad hoc smaller ones, we just have a naming convention and a folder convention. And I think we've done a presentation on one of the peer-to-peers to how we name our folders, what goes in each folder, and what the naming convention is within those folders. That's it. So you don't have to do more because as soon as you know every folder has the same names, every folder you know what in the code folder is, what is in the out folder, what is in the documents folder, and what is, so it's just you know where things are. So just that simple organizational piece has helped tremendously that I can now go to any analyst's folder. I know the project title, I immediately know and can replicate what they've done. So just that piece has tremendously helped. And on top of that, then we, as I said, we did standardize the applications. So SQL is the base. You cannot use anything else. You have to learn coding. And so the first month, usually for my analysts, is we have like 50 SQL questions. And just from day one to maybe week 3 or so, all they do is go through these SQL exercises and to kind of learn all the different larger or broader areas of our data warehouse in SQL. Because SQL is a very, very easy language per se. It's just, select from where. So you have to select, the variable from which table and maybe where the filters and maybe combine them and then learning how to combine different tables. So it's not a difficult language to learn, and so I think for people who have never learned anything, it seems to be a good bar in the beginning and sets the expectations, and I think that is the standard. Then again, as I said, I'm open if it's data or R. It has to be code based. It has to be replicable. You have to, if you have somebody's code, you just need to be able to open it and run it, right? Anybody should be able to open the code, run it, and not run into any big errors. So those were kind of the standards. And then the third piece is, and so this was a little bit of a long way of talking about this team meeting. So we have instituted a team meeting, a weekly team meeting, just to understand what people are working on, because it is surprising, even though you see each other every day, you sometimes don't realize that somebody else is working on the same project. So that team meeting is just a quick overview of what people are working on, and if somebody is close to completion on a project or on a cool thing, then we do review of like kind of maybe a more typical review of just the results. Let's say somebody has a new dashboard or somebody created a new report or somebody's just about to send out an email and just wanted to double check, is that wording clear or something like that. So we just do kind of these quick reviews, dashboard reviews, get quick feedback. And in a little bit higher stakes or things that are new, we go into code review. So the entire team, and you then see, and then you show people, look, this is my folder structure. Here are the files that I'm using. You double click on that file. Here's the code, and you start going through code review. And that has been really helpful. It's helpful catching errors, but it's also a professional development tool because you have different levels of expertise within your team in either in different areas. Either it's statistical, maybe it's data management, maybe it is approaches, maybe it is certain packages that you've not heard about. So it's both professional development, so you can learn what other peoples are working on, as well as kind of a quality control of the output. And that has really worked well. In fact, when we went online in COVID, we increased those team meetings to twice a week. And we've had such a great team spirit, even during COVID, because you never felt alone. These team meetings, I was looking forward to them because you can talk to people, you reviewed, and you always felt connected. Now that we are more in person again, we did it only once a week. But so these team meetings, nobody likes meetings, right? No, at first I was like, should I do this or not? But it has truly become beneficial because sometimes people also don't want to bug other people, but they do have kind of something they want to present. So everybody has the opportunity to present. Everybody has the opportunity to kind of showcase what they're working on. So it has really worked well. So there's this combination of onboarding, having a certain structure and defined process, and these weekly meetings have created a good quality control for what we're working on.
Now,
How
that's
about you? What are
awesome.
you doing?
So that I really like that approach, especially with the coding. I think starting with just the files, I'll start there. I think that's a key element to have, what files you're pulling from, even down to, and so when we talk with my team, we actually look at the data with what's in the data file that you gathered. And so what we've developed locally is what I call as a giga file. So a giga file, instead of pinging the data warehouse every time, because guess what, your data may change. And so looking at consistent, because you want to update your mega file like pretty consistently, but having a flat date, like almost like local type of warehouse of data. So we built, like I said, a giga file. Everything's built off that file. Program review, dashboards, everything. Why is that? KPIs, everything. Why? Because everything's 100% consistent. We went through as a team and completely cleaned the data. Look through the SQL, look how it was pulled, have that consistent data piece. And like I said, we update that. It can be weekly. Like I've updated one, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 times this week just because we have new information flowing through. But if you can think of like almost like imagine MIS all in one big file, like huge. And so looking at that and having consistency, because that was the biggest thing: consistency, relevancy, and integrity. How do we make sure that's right? So going down, because one of the biggest challenges we see is students who maybe forgot to specify their gender or their gender identity or their race or ethnicity. How does that look over time? What's changed? How can you adjust and make sure that everything's consistent? The terminology, the language, things of that magnitude. That's what we started with. What's a common thing we're going to call it? So let's use ethnicity, for example. There's so many which ways to list that. You could use 190 that are going to be coming out, or you can use like the truncated one. Really having data standards is what we started with first, and reviewing that data standards process. And then looking to something called what we call coding standards, working with, like I said, our large district teams of everybody all together to discuss, prioritize, and put together the different nuances of, well, how are we going to get this? Where does this data come from? Defining those frameworks and then creating a standard set of SQL that everyone uses. So we know the data is being pulled the same exact way. So Loris doesn't have to write it. Aaron doesn't have to write it. Anybody else doesn't have to write the code over. Copy, paste, run. And then building and sharing in our report writing system. It's a SQL-based system like code that says, okay, everybody, we're running academic history this way. And creating a lot of views that refresh on a consistent basis. So really trying to build out, how do you build a standard of quality across everything where everyone's speaking the same language, right? And so I think that's where we started with. And so that process happens. It used to happen every 2 weeks where everyone would meet and we would take on specific topics. Like, how are we defining? So are we using IPED's definition of ethnicity or using different groups? So for example, IPED's, you have, if someone's Hispanic, Latinx, and if you're two or more races, that's actually counted in there. But we actually have variables that count across for us to say, because in two or more races, you may have Asian American students. Well, that may count as an Anapesi student in the Anapesi data pool. So let's flag that for that. Or same thing with our emoji data pool, or same thing with our HSI data pool. So building those out as variables across and agreeing upon the same logic was one of the approaches we've used. We
Can
all
I
use
ask
SQL.
something there?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Because the only downside of having like one standard is that depending on the project, you often have to veer off that standard. Let's say ethnicity, right? So the typical ethnicity one is, let's say you take the most recent one, right? Because it might change over time. You want to take the most recent that is not missing. Well, that might not be applicable for if you want to do an analysis of application to enrollment, right? So you want to see what was their ethnicity as part of their enrollment and when did they change it? How often do they change it? Or you might look at it differently. Let's say you do an NAPZ application and you want to recategorize instead of going away from iPad's definitions. You want to say anybody who is selected so it's so project specific that sometimes we've realized with these standards, you spend so much time creating a standard and then you always break it because it's so project specific. So what is your leeway in terms of veering off the standard, and when should you stay with a certain standard that you've set for a specific data field?
So this is a great example. And so for us, when we have usually the iPad's definition, but then we have what's been entered into the system, and then we also have, because when they have multiple ethnicity, we list all those out. But typically they're listed in multiple rows, trying to bring those to one column. Then in addition to that, what is an ANAPZ flag? So we make a lot of flags, like a yes/no variable, like basically binary data, and just put that across to say that. So instead of having to rerun the code for a specific thing, we try to think of every which way we want to splice the data, all the way down to those raw variables. So it's not just one code. While we'll use a standardized code like an iPads for majority of reports, we have the capability in these systems we've built out to flag those things and really look at it. Because what was, like, for example, age of student, what term during the year, when they started the term, when they ended the term, right? When they began the year or started the year, when they applied. So having variables identified for all those different elements has been a key individual thing, because you're right. A lot of people ask questions. What's the median age? What's the mode age? What's the youngest? What's the oldest at what point in time? Right? And so as we examine that, that's how we've built those like mega files out to do those types of things. I think standardization helps with data quality over time, but you have to be able to build your databases. We've done, at least, to account for those nuances. And I think, to me, again, when you have the expanded version of the race ethnicity categories, what does that look like? Because we've run reports to say, what's the broad diversity of our students? Because that's been a conversation we've had. And what does that look like? And so not having to recreate the wheel, building that into our systems, and then having those definitions. Because a lot of the times, if many people who use like an MIS, you'll have a simple code like HX or W or B. And once again, if you don't have that validated across, what does that mean? Or you have the XXXXY, XXXXX. What does that mean? And so having that variable to the XXXY, but then having the interpretation upon it is what we've also included. So we understand what's that base thing that's been entered. But I think, to me, that's a good question about how has it changed over time. And I think that's an element. Once again, we just make sure it's the most up to date as of that term. But reverse engineering it, unless it's called an unknown, like, so what I usually don't call them unknowns, because there's blanks and unknowns, and typically I couple those as unreported. But if there's unreported, if we can get more information that's more relevant, we go and replace unreported variables in the past, just so for consistency purposes. At least that's what's helped me out. And then I also look at for the why. How many people are going to say, how did this change over time? What's the probability of occurrence that I'm going to even ask that question? And what's the purpose of that question being asked? So I have to anticipate what the deliverables are that we're going to give, or what we're going to use, and why would that be important? And so I have to think about that as we build these different things. But we've gone all the way through, even to pulling in new data that doesn't exist, like in our system, like inside, we use Banner. And inside of Banner, they don't have certain tables that exist for student characteristics. And so we bring new things in from the application. What does that look like? Where do you go? What does that live? How is that coded? And then framing that way. Those are a few examples of how we've done it, but really trying to house that into our system. And it's interesting, like you talked about, how you put together almost a standardized structure. Like, here's our code, here's our data files, like following that same logic. It's been very helpful because, you get a trillion requests just like every office does. And if you're calling everything like pizza or whatever, like, you don't know what that is, right? Or if you go in and everybody like leaves, like, you don't know where to go through their files. But having, just like, we just went and created, I don't know, a 70-page AB 705 report for our district board. And so all three schools have different ways of doing it, but we all have a similar logic of, here's what we do in teams. And so we shared everything in teams. Here's the stuff. We didn't have to use coding or anything, but here's the output from all the things. And so we just jumped on a teams meeting similar to you. How are we going about it? And we put together this 60-page thing in 3 days. Like, it's pretty quick turnaround with narrative and everything, but we had a basis to build upon, and we had, I'd say, historical type of stories to look at. We're not starting from a blank screen. And I think that's been beneficial to us, because sometimes, we look at things and processes, and unless you have a really good memory, you have to think, okay, when we talked about first time degree seeking students, did we include or exclude vocational degrees? Well, yes, we did. What defines a first time student? Not just the indicator they put in on their application, but reverse engineering that across the district to determine, were they actually first time students, and having that documented and then clarified and discussed. And I think one of the big features that you mentioned that we have is that troubleshooting aspect, where you can kind of troubleshoot with ChatGPT or troubleshoot with your notes, but having that individual to say, well, why'd you do it this way? Or this is the approach we took, and then coming to an agreement. I think that's another part of consistency and standardization that makes it a lot easier. Because like I said, I think when we start going through our coding and looking at our different steps, there's a million different ways to write SQL. There is. I teach it, trust me. You can do it 1,000 different ways. But having that common thing where it's been tested and continually refined, I think that's the biggest thing that I think our college and then others could probably continue to replicate is, well, this worked right now for polling like term code or term variable or academic year. But as our systems mature, is that the right way? And continually editing that. So that's worked for us. I think having that shared document in those meetings to discuss, hey, here's new variables coming down the pipeline, or hey, here's new reports we created. Like our district director, he's brilliant. He built this thing in Argos where he wrote SQL that basically you can go through and it runs it across all the curriculum and determines, was this class coded properly and is it generating any FTES, and then color codes it, puts out a report with all the red flags to say, this is yellow, you could adjust this is red, you need to make this change. And so our curriculum individuals will take those reports and make those changes, but documenting how we put that together was really helpful. And I think, to me, that's really increased our 320 report accuracy, and that's our apportionment report for anybody listening. And so I think doing things like that, instead of just pressing a button like, oh, we finished the 320, well, how'd you do it? And then writing actually documentation books, like we did that for our 320 report, because we have auditors that come and ask us, like, how did you get to these numbers? And so we just open up our manual. Here's how we do it with screenshots and step by step. And we review that on an annual basis to say, have we adjusted anything? If we make manual adjustments, why is that? And so where do you do that? So similar to what you said, if we all leave, win the lottery and leave, can someone pick up our work and move forward? And I think that's the testament of the work is, as you onboard new people, can they get up and running quickly? And I think that's the key element. Like, just pointing, we just got 2 new research people in the office over here. And so we tested that. So they got the data element dictionary, they got the data code approach, they met the team, we meet weekly. And I said, okay, these new applications, because we're moving from Tableau to Power BI. You understand Power BI better than most people. I want you to replicate this from here. Here's your data sources. Look at the dictionary. Show me what you can do, and then we'll reflect on that. And tell me what you learned along the way. Because sometimes I feel that people need to do a little bit of that learning as opposed to being like, press this button. Because it's easy to press the button. Yeah. But how do we get them to that learning? Because I asked them, what nuances are you finding in this platform compared to the other? How is it accepting the nulls in this? How is it reflecting on that? And letting them tell me what they're finding, and then we troubleshoot together, kind of like your weekly coding. And so I think to me that's been successful, at least just in my experience. Or even like I said, today we just looked at how do you calculate total unit accumulation across multiple colleges based on a certain date time frame, right? And so each college had a different approach to doing things, which was fine. But we sat down today for about an hour and compared our approaches on how things were done. And then all agreed upon, okay, for this report, we're all accepting this. Done. So I think that's the approach we've been using. So it's very, I'll say ad hoc. While we have standard processes, I think it also is project dependent. It's just depending upon our documentation. So it's been helpful. I don't know, it's very similar to what you do. Maybe not as like expansive, but similar.
No, that sounds very similar. Yeah, so that is kind of the thing that I'm wrestling with is initially when we talk standardization, I kind of rebel against it because I feel it is so project specific, right? But the downside of that one, obviously, and I'm not talking about 320 reports or some official reports. That's where it has to be completely auditable. It has to have standards. So I'm taking those out. I'm taking more kind of the project, the ad hoc requests. Um, and however, there, what you run potentially into issues if you have a different definition for every project. You sometimes forget what the definition was, right? If somebody asks, so how did you define ethnicity in this one? You're like, oh, because you don't have a
Right.
standard process, you forgot what it is for that specific thing. So that's a little bit the downside. But I do believe it increases the accuracy if you do that. So this is a trade-off I am willing to make to have maybe not every report has the same standard in terms of the way you define it, but because it is very important that, let's say, for an NAPZ application, you use that flag or you do create a different ethnicity definition because it is an important definition for that. Or even, let's say socioeconomic status, you might have different definitions for that depending on what you're trying to measure, trying to figure out. Are you actually talking about financial aid students? Are you not talking about students on financial aid? So I am usually tending more towards the ad hoc project specific definition, but I am learning sometimes, that you can run into issues down the line. So I'm always impressed by people who have these, predefined everything because that is very time consuming to come to a definition, to come to an agreement, to come to something that is standardized.
Yeah, and I think like you said, it really comes over time because when you first walk into an institution, and we'll close out soon, but when you come to an institution, you may have a way of doing things at your previous institution or how you've maybe gone through your formal training. And I think to me, while it's good to bring that as a framework, I think also learning what the institution needs. So coming from a school that was just an HSI to an ANAPZ and HSI school, understanding, well, if this is something we're consistently looking at, how are we determining that? And asking those type of leading questions like, and I think that's some of the things as we bring on new analysts, one, hear their perspective, but also understanding the culture and the commonalities of our institutions. And I think that's a key element is in relation to what we produce. And also for me, when we come to projects is what does that look like on our standard reports calendar, our research calendar, our refresh of dashboards and things of that magnitude. So you can also say those are the methods we use. I just think about that like the other day, someone wanted a report where EWs were counted as a non-success, you know? And so that obviously impacts everything. So went from the standard definition. So you're like, okay, well, see, we have this report that already has the grades in it that obviously no one else sees but us. We clean that out. We make sure it just runs the filter this way. So we have one like an indicator with EWs, no EWs, eyes, no eyes, like a whole bunch of things. But having those definitions and then also being able to easily navigate to that so people can understand how to use it in your team, I think that's also a key element. And like I said, that continual training and conversation is like, I think when I think back of my team here, the way we did things about like 5 or 6 years ago is way different than the way we're doing it now. I think our stuff continues to evolve, but we need to change our practices. I've worked with colleagues who've done the same things for like 20 years, and that's cool. But we have to make sure that we're, on the same page and continually just moving forward. And I think sometimes things do have to get messy, and you do have to put a report up in front of your team to be like, that's terrible. Where did these numbers come from? How did you do this? And it's not to chastise anybody, but it's to really troubleshoot and better understand what is occurring in the platforms, in the systems, in the coding, and the like. And you're right. Sometimes when it's easy to do the point and click GUI interface, which I love doing, FYI, it's super easy. I can do the coding, but when I have like 2 minutes to do something, I'll have time for the code. Then we have tons of saved code, so don't think I'm that ridiculous. But I think to me, is it right? How do you know? Is it applicable? How do you know? I think those are key elements and questions to even have, not just before, but then after. So cool. So, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think these conversations are interesting. I appreciate your Data and Donut series, and the peer-to-peer and the collaboration between offices, because as you said, we should evolve. We should learn from others what is working. I strive to continually innovate and see what works, what doesn't work, both internally, both with depending on what team strengths you have. And I do believe some standardization is needed in terms of having, so for us, it has to be code based so it is replicable, but having enough flexibility enough to, because you hire people because they're strong people, right? So you hire people and then putting them in this straitjacket of you are only allowed to do it this way is counterintuitive, right? So finding a way that you can have solid and good quality data and research, but at the same time give people the opportunity to expand and work freely. I think that is one of my goals, to keep my team motivated, to keep them continually on a path of professional development, and not just bog them down with requirements and data files. Nobody writes to write project reports and constantly talking about data element definitions. So there is a little bit of a balance, and so these conversations can sometimes help us think through what processes we have, what are needed, which ones can be updated, which one can you relax, or to your point, where do you have to have an absolute stringent definition, because this is a 320 report. This is something that goes to the board. You have to have those numbers very clear. So those are sometimes kind of the gray areas. But I'm happy to learn from others in that regard.
Most definitely. Well, thanks so much, Loris. I think it's been a good conversation. I think it's a conversation we'll probably want to continue to keep pushing forward. I have some other thoughts on us talking about maybe even a demonstration of some open source stuff. So maybe that'll be our next conversation we have.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, it's been fun. I'll chat with you later.
Thanks so much, Aaron.